In Australia, the government made a shocking decision to tear down completely a giant freshwater lake that they themselves had spent millions of dollars building. By ripping open a dam wall 7.5 kilometers long, they drained millions of cubic meters of water in just 48 hours. When the water was finally gone, what remained on the lakebed was not fertile land, but a true ecological tragedy. It was a graveyard of compacted mud, reeking of decay, tangled with 200,000 dead ancient trees still standing. For 40 years, 8,750 hectares of this land had been strangled beneath water, filled with toxic algae. This ecosystem had been completely exhausted, leaving behind a barren layer of mud on the bottom that looked like the surface of Mars and was totally devoid of life. No one believed this toxic land could recover. But what is astonishing is that it regenerated itself. A spectacular transformation so dramatic that even scientists could hardly believe their own eyes. Exactly how could a toxic mud desert reverse its own decline and come back to life as a miracle? The secret behind nature's self-healing mechanism is about to be revealed. Before 1970, the Winton Wetlands were a wonder of natural balance. They were a complex network of marshes, open water, and river red gum forests woven tightly together. River red gums were not just trees. In this ecosystem, they were the pillars supporting the entire biological network. These giant trees, with roots driven deep into the earth, functioned like enormous biological pumps, regulating groundwater levels. Their canopies created a perfect microclimate for waterbirds, while their hollow trunks served as survival launch pads for countless mammals and reptiles. This land operated in rhythm with the natural cycle of drought and flooding on the harshest continent on Earth. Then, human intervention appeared. In the early 70s, driven by the desire to conquer nature and secure water supplies for agriculture, a wall of earth and rock 7.5 kilometers long was built. Blocking the broken river, the water began to rise. 8,750 hectares of wetlands, forest, and grassland were submerged. Lake Mokoan was officially born. But the water did not bring life. It brought silent and total destruction. River red gums can survive major floods, lasting a few months, but they did not evolve to remain underwater forever. When the water level of Lake Mokoan was fixed in place, the roots of hundreds of thousands of ancient trees were cut off from oxygen. The decay began in the roots, spread upward through the trunks, and in the end, the great canopies collapsed. An estimated 150,000 to 200,000 river red gums died standing. The landscape became covered with gray, stripped trunks stabbing upward from the water like gigantic gravestones. Along with the death of the forest, thousands of sacred sites of the Yorta Yorta people trees, bearing centuries-old scars, where bark had been removed to make canoes, and shields were erased beneath the water. The ecological foundation and cultural memory were severed at the exact same moment. A distorted ecosystem never remains still. It generates extreme side effects. The fatal flaw of Lake Mokoan lay in its physical design. This lake had an enormous surface area, yet it was incredibly shallow. Under the skin-scorching summer sun of Australia, Lake Mokoan turned into a giant boiling pan. The water heated up quickly, leading to a destructive physical phenomenon: extreme evaporation. Every year, this shallow design caused the lake to lose as much as 50,000 megaliters of water. To make that easier to imagine, the water evaporating into the air each year was enough to fill 20,000 standard Olympic swimming pools. A structure built to hold water became the most efficient water evaporation machine in the region. This waste was a severe failure for humanity's ambition to control nature. But that was not the worst part. The stillness of the water, combined with high temperatures and excess nutrients from the flooded soil, triggered a chain of deadly biological reactions. In the early 1990s, Lake Mokoan experienced an explosion of blue-green algae. Blue-green algae are not plants, they are photosynthetic bacteria. When they bloom into enormous mats across the surface, they drain the oxygen and block sunlight from reaching the bottom of the lake. Plankton starved to death, pulling native fish species down with them into collapse. Even more dangerously, blue-green algae release cyanotoxins powerful enough to kill livestock drinking along the shore and to cause liver and nervous system damage in humans. The lake was closed completely. It became so toxic that it could no longer be used for swimming, and it was entirely useless for agricultural irrigation. The food chain was crushed. Waterbirds flew elsewhere. Biodiversity declined severely. The government fell into a costly, vicious cycle. They had to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars every year to maintain a toxic reservoir that evaporated most of its stored water and killed every organism that touched it. The truth had been exposed. Artificial intervention against the laws of nature had led to a complete ecological bankruptcy. In the early 2000s, awareness of rewilding began spreading across the world. Instead of trying to manage artificial systems that were falling apart, scientists realized that the most effective strategy was often to remove the barriers completely and let nature find its balance again on its own. In 2009, after years of facing brutal data on water loss and toxic algae, the government of Victoria approved a budget of $17 million, not to build more channels, not to buy algae-killing chemicals, but to dismantle the entire dam. This was one of the riskiest efforts imaginable. Piercing a stone wall 7.5 kilometers long meant throwing away decades of engineering effort with their own hands. More than that, scientists raised a difficult question. The soil surface at the bottom of the lake had been submerged under stagnant water for nearly 40 years. The soil structure had been compacted, stripped of all beneficial microorganisms, oxygen, and nutrients. It had turned into a barren crust like the surface of Mars. If the water was drained away, would that land become a dusty wasteland, opening the door for invasive weeds and alien species to take over? Excavators began cutting through layers of boulders and the earth core of the embankment. The moment the wall was breached, high-pressure water roared out. In less than 2 days, the massive volume of water was pushed off the floodplain. The naked lakebed appeared. The stench of rotting mud and decomposing carcasses rose thick into the air. Mudflats stretched out without end, marked by the dark silhouettes of tens of thousands of dead tree stumps. But the moment the water receded was also the first time in 4 decades that the broken river was able to flow again to its own free rhythm. The water no longer stood still in a silent basin, but moved, threading its way into side channels and bringing the capillary structure of the floodplain back to life. Nature needs time to heal itself, but after 40 years of burial, the compacted ground needed a mechanical push to break its barren crust apart. The restoration campaign began with an act of historical atonement, replanting exactly the number of river-red gum trees that had died when the dam was built. 150,000 trees. This was one of the largest manual ecological intervention projects in history. An army of ecologists, local residents, and Yorta elders carried shovels and saplings into the cracked basin of the former lake. The specialists clearly understood the principle for unlocking an ecosystem. When you bring back the architectural species of the environment, the entire food web will automatically follow. The roots of the young gum trees worked like biological drill bits. They pierced through mud hardened like stone, ripping open the compacted ground and creating gaps. Through those gaps, oxygen from the air and rainwater began seeping deep into the lower soil layers. The earth began to breathe again. Leaves falling onto the barren ground began to decompose, returning enormous amounts of carbon and nitrogen and rebuilding the organic humus layer. Bacteria, fungi, and nematodes, the invisible foundation bricks of the food web, exploded in population within the soil. It was precisely through the biological activity of tree roots that the 40-year degradation of soil structure was completely reversed. The Yorta elders also applied their ancient ecological knowledge to the restoration. They planted trees in strategic clusters rather than in artificial rows. These clusters created micro-ecological corridors, helping reduce the evaporation of surface moisture and providing crucial windbreaks for other fragile plant species to germinate. If the collapse happened slowly, the recovery erupted with the speed of a biological explosion. The revival did not begin from the ground, but fell from the sky. As soon as the natural hydrological cycle returned to operation, flooded in the wet season and cracked dry in the dry season, the seeds of wetland plants that had remained dormant beneath the mud for 40 years began sprouting with force. Vegetation burst into growth. Insects returned. And when insects appear, the biological radar of apex predators is activated. In just the first 5 years, the deadly silence was torn apart by the wing beats of hundreds of thousands of birds. Flocks of black swans returned to settle in the open water. Ibises and white-faced herons also appeared to search for food among the growing reeds. Most astonishing of all, scientists recorded the return of 180 different bird species in a single breeding season. The Winton Wetlands became a giant refueling station for global migration routes. Latham snipe, flying more than 8,000 kilometers directly from Japan, landed with precision in this very area. The Australasian bittern, a mysterious hidden predator and one of the rarest species in the world, also returned to. Next came the rebirth of underwater food chains. The broken river was no longer blocked, allowing native fish runs to swim upstream and breed in the shallow floodwaters. They became an enormous source of protein. At night, the sounds of life replaced the silence. The explosion of amphibians, such as the banjo frog and the growling grass frog species that are highly sensitive to toxins, proved that the water had been completely purified. Toxic blue-green algae disappeared because the water was now circulating, carrying abundant dissolved oxygen. More than a decade after the dam was destroyed, the scene was a staggering contrast. Young gum trees were growing vigorously right beside the remains of the old forest. The present habitat has a far more complex structure, greater resilience, and much higher diversity than the artificial reservoir ever had. Nature has proven its extraordinary power of self-recovery once physical barriers are removed. There is a bitter truth that humans often ignore when interfering with nature. Maintaining artificial structures that do not fit the environment usually consumes enormous resources, while restoring nature creates lasting economic value. The decision to remove the dam, which cost $17 million at the start, was fiercely criticized by many people as a waste of public assets. But the economic reality proved the exact opposite. By eliminating the toxic lake, the authorities completely cut off the massive financial burden of annual maintenance and water treatment costs. More than that, the rebirth of the Winton Wetlands created a new force of attraction: ecotourism. Before the dam was removed, a poisonous lake full of dead trees attracted only a few thousand curious visitors. But now, the number of tourists pouring in has passed 65,000 people every year and is still rising rapidly. This area draws thousands of visitors who come to witness one of the most successful ecological restoration projects, including researchers, wildlife photographers, and travelers who love nature. The nearby small towns, once trapped in economic decline, are now booming again. The return of wildlife has brought between $10 and $15 million every year into the local economy through accommodation, food services, and exploration tours. Humans have finally learned the core lesson: you cannot separate the survival of the economy from the health of the ecosystem. A dead ecosystem will drag down a dead economy with it. The recovery of Winton is not just a local project. It is the clearest proof of a trend that is changing environmental management strategy across the world, removing water infrastructure that is no longer suitable. Over the past decade, the world has removed thousands of dams. In North America, large-scale projects on the Klamath River are restoring the natural migration route of salmon. In Europe, Spain and France are also leading the way in removing barriers from rivers. The concrete structures that once stood as engineering symbols of the 20th century are now being re-evaluated because of their negative environmental impacts in the 21st century. Ecosystems do not need us to manage them with concrete and chemicals. Reality shows that when an ecosystem is in decline, the most effective solution is sometimes not to apply even more complex technology. The optimal method is this: minimize human intervention, remove artificial barriers, and allow natural cycles to carry out the process of recovery on their own. 40 years of being submerged and brutally destroyed, yet it took only a little more than a decade for the land to heal itself. The vitality of nature is indestructible, as long as we are willing to give space back to it. After this video, how do you evaluate the strategy of removing artificial structures in order to restore the natural environment? Are there other infrastructure projects around the world that should be reconsidered from an ecological perspective? Leave your opinion in the comments below. Thank you for following today's Science and Discovery feature. And do not forget to hit like and subscribe to the channel to support us in future projects. Goodbye, and see you again.